You know, in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul mentions a thorn in his flesh that he begged God to remove. And some of us can relate to this thorn, something that's difficult and hard to bear, something that's painful, whether it be physical, spiritual, or emotional. Some speculate that this thorn is a physical issue, like Paul has an issue with his eyes or maybe a speech impediment. Others speculate that this is some kind of spiritual temptation or some kind of past emotional trauma. But what is this thorn that Paul had in his flesh? And should we expect to have the same thing? Let's jump into the Word of God to see what God actually says about this thorn in the flesh and how to deal with something difficult like this. So 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7 is where Paul talks about this thorn in his flesh. And he says, "So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh." So there are a few things I want you to really pay attention to about this thorn, okay? Number one, this is within the context of Paul remaining humble and not growing conceited because he's had some incredible revelations from God. So part of the way that God actually keeps Paul, with all this greatness, humble is by allowing a thorn in his life that isn't given by God, right? It's actually given apparently by the enemy. But God has ordained and sovereignly allowed such a thing, kind of like what we see in Job, where the enemy comes to Job, but the enemy has to go through God to get to Job, right? And so we see that, number one, this thorn in Paul's life is actually something that keeps Paul from growing conceited because he's had some profound revelations. It keeps him humble and dependent and relying on God, okay? A thorn was given to me in the flesh. Now, this is something that I want to highlight. Is it specifically referred to as being in the flesh? That doesn't mean it's purely physical. That doesn't mean it's either emotional or spiritual or mental. What we know is it is something that has to do with this present world, okay? In the flesh, being something that is present and near. Maybe it's physical and material in nature, but maybe it's actually something that has to do with the fleshly nature. We'll soon find out what Paul's referring to, okay? A messenger of Satan was given to harass me. Okay, so the second thing Paul says about this thorn is it's actually involving a messenger of Satan. Is this a spiritual being? Is this a real person? Is this a group of people? Is this something that plagues Paul and mentally and emotionally that is a metaphorical messenger from Satan? So we know that the thorn involves some kind of being sent from Satan, which means it has some dark agenda behind it. Meaning that if Satan sent this messenger, whatever this messenger is, which is the thorn in Paul's flesh, it can't be a good thing. What we're going to see is that what God does through it ends up being good for Paul, okay? So the intent of this thorn, who it comes from, is something that has a sinister kind of dark agenda behind it. So it's a messenger of Satan to harass Paul. In other words, that's why we know it's something that's not fantastic. It's not good intent. It's actually with ill motives, whoever sent this being Satan, I think. The harassment there is what gives us an indication that this is not something that is a positive thing. It's actually negative. So this thorn is given to Paul because of the greatness of the revelations. God allows it, and it's harassing Paul. Or he or they are harassing Paul, a messenger from Satan, to keep me from becoming conceited. So twice, Paul mentions this. This is keeping me from becoming conceited. He's not minimizing the fact that there might be a dark agenda behind this thorn that is a messenger of Satan. But what he does acknowledge and focus on is the fact that God's ultimate purpose triumphs with this thorn in the flesh. So I just want you to pay attention to a few things that Paul wants us to know about this thorn. He says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this. About what? This messenger of Satan, this thorn given in the flesh. It doesn't seem to be a physical thorn as much as it is a figurative thorn or a representation of some plaguing, a difficult, painful circumstance, something that's bothersome, that is difficult to deal with. Because Paul says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me, okay? But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. And I want to highlight the sufficiency of God's grace here in the midst of this thorn being present in the flesh. It doesn't minimize the sufficiency of God's grace. It actually maximizes Paul's awareness or increases Paul's awareness of how sufficient the grace of God is in his life. whether that be to endure this and let it hang around and Paul just learns to endure, or something, maybe the grace is given for Paul to overcome and triumph over this and actually remove it. Whatever's happening, God's grace is sufficient in the midst of it, okay, to accomplish something. So he says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So we know that this thorn, actually by the mouth of God, is something that he refers to as a weakness. And God says, yeah, it's a weakness, something in the flesh that is a messenger of Satan to harass you and make your life harder. But God says, my power is made perfect in the midst of this weakness. So we know that this thorn in the flesh is a kind of weakness. Is it emotional? Is it spiritual? Is it physical? I think we can all resonate with the thorn in the flesh in the sense that we all have a kind of weakness in our life that we beg God to take away. But in fact, his power is made perfect or realized or accomplished and manifested through that weakness we'd rather just pray away. Therefore, Paul says, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. In other words, there's more of God's power in Paul's life, the more there is weakness around him. In other words, the weakness becomes a reason to lean more into God and more rely on the power of Christ in his life. So Paul, through this weakness, through this messenger of Satan that harasses him, through this thorn in the flesh, Paul becomes more aware of his need for the power of Christ in his life. So he becomes more dependent on God. And he's going to see more of God's power through this weakness that he'd rather just pray away. But God doesn't necessarily take away quite yet. So he says, I'm content, and I'm actually boast. He says, I'm going to boast more gladly of these weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Weaknesses, very simply in this context, refer to something that is outside of Paul's control, something that is outside of our control, some deficiency, something that happened in our past, something that we really corners us and backs us up against the wall, and we can do nothing about it except look to God and pray and ask for help. This weakness is something that Paul realizes it causes me to lean on God for more of his power. For the sake of Christ, and I'm content with weaknesses. Now look at what he describes as weaknesses. He's not referring to temptation here. He's not referring to sin. That doesn't mean these things aren't involved in thorns that can plague us. But in the context, he says these are insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, or you might say, when I go through these things, then I'm strong. Because Paul's faithfully following God, being an apostle, stewarding the gospel, laying the foundation of the church upon Christ as an apostle. And Paul's faithfulness is resulting in what? Insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities. These are difficult circumstances that arise from faithfulness. And the result of our obedience to God are these difficulties, these weaknesses that we can do nothing about, that are outside of our control, that we can't change or alter. We can just look to God for the grace that he promises is sufficient for us not just to endure, but sometimes to even overcome and triumph and get over these things. So let's go back to chapter 11. And I want to show you something that is, I think, going to reveal more to us what the thorn is, okay? We know it's something that is a messenger. He refers to it as a messenger of Satan, something that is a thorn in his flesh, something that is nagging and bothersome and painful, and he'd rather go away, and something that is a weakness that causes him to lean more on God. Well, in 2 Corinthians 11, just a chapter before this, as Paul leads into chapter 12, he's talking about his sufferings as an apostle. And this is incredibly important for us to understand, as Paul is defending his apostolic authority, his apostleship from Christ. He's having to expose these fake apostles that are trying to discredit him. And in the process, it might seem like he's being arrogant and, wow, Paul, look at your resume. But Paul said, no, my resume is actually my sufferings that I endure for Christ. He says, I repeat, let no one think me foolish. But even if you do, accept me as a fool so that I too may boast a little. What I'm saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. In other words, what he's about to say, he's presenting it. This is how a fool would communicate these things. This is how a fool or what a fool would be looking for when it comes to the apostolic authority. So you know what? I'm going to talk as one so that I can relate to you on the level that it appears you guys are functioning on. So let me say this as a fool. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. In other words, if you want me to play this game, I will. Let me show you why I'm the apostle that the Lord has commissioned me to be. For you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. Now watch, as my daughter screams in the background. Whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I'm speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offsprings of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. I'm talking like a madman, and Paul knows this, but Paul has to communicate these ideas on the level that they're able to receive them. With far greater labors, far more imprisonments. Now look at the things Paul starts listing as his credentials for being an apostle. Greater labors, which is work, difficult labor, far more imprisonments. Who would brag about being imprisoned? With countless beatings. Who would brag about being beat? Often near death. That's not something you want to talk about when you first meet someone. You know, I've almost been beat to death several times. That's not something that you want to be excited about and boast about. And yet Paul is doing that here to defend his apostolic authority. And this leads perfectly into chapter 12 when he talks about the harassment, the plaguing thorn in his flesh, the difficulty and the weaknesses. I think he's referring to persecutions that come from faithfulness, that arise from Paul being obedient to God. 5 times. 5 times what, Paul? Well, 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes less one. I'm using yellow just because I want to use a different color. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Not stoned, but actually pelted with rocks. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I had to clarify because some of you actually don't know that. A night and a day I was adrift at sea. Look at the suffering of this guy. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers. On every side of Paul's life is danger. In toil, in hardship, sleepless nights, hunger, thirst, without food, cold and exposure. He's going on and on. And apart from other things, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who's going to brag about anxiety? Who's going to put that on their resume when they're like, let me defend my case and show you why I am who God says I am? I'm anxious. I've been beat. I've been shipwrecked. I've been in prison. Most people would brag about the successes and the spiritual victories in their life. Paul is talking about what God has brought him through. Now watch. Who is weak? And I'm not weak. Who's made to fall and I'm not indignant? Paul begins to mention or relate this concept of weakness to everything he's listed up here. In other words, in the mind of Paul here in this context, weakness, being weak, is actually being put in these difficult situations where you have no power, no control, no ability to maneuver your way out, your back is against the wall, and you can do nothing but look to God for help. If I must boast, I'll boast of the things that show my what? His weakness. In other words, all of the persecutions and sufferings and trials reveal his weakness, his deficiency, his inability to do anything without God, his dependence on the Father, his human, inability when it comes to, knowledge can't do anything in this situation, power can't do anything, authority, none of that. You are weak and you can't change anything that's going on in your life. And Paul would say those situations show my weakness, right? But they actually become, like we see in chapter 12, a demonstration of God's power and actually a platform for God's power. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows I'm not lying. Then he goes on, at Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me. This is humiliating. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. So when we get here to the weaknesses and the thorn in his flesh, we can say for certain that the surrounding context indicates the weakness and the thorn in the flesh actually involves, but is not limited to, these sufferings and persecutions and calamities that result from faithfully following God, troubles and trials and worldly tribulation, being, beaten and shipwrecked and imprisoned, things that you and I, frankly, have no grid for. And Paul's like, that's just a normal daily experience. Those things that you go, what a weak guy. He goes, no. Well, yeah, I'm weak, but God makes me strong and his grace is sufficient. And I've seen his power when I've been cornered into situations I can do nothing about. Let me take you to a few passages that I think are going to bring even more clarity to what's going on here. What I'm going to do is switch my screen, and I'm going to show you a few passages. You get to see my handy dandy phone. Cool stuff. That's how I record these. But I want to take you to a few passages in the Old Testament, and I got to do it here because I can't just flip through my Bible the way I can do on this app. So let's make sure that it's actually going. Cool. In Numbers chapter 33, I want you to take note of the language that's used. Okay? It's very intentional. And I think it gives us an indication of what Paul's going through. This is not just a random word study. Let's see where this word appears. It relates to what Paul's talking about. Numbers 33, 55 through 56. You have talking about the tribes and the inheritance and the land of Israel that they're going to inherit. Okay? Moses, or God through Moses, I believe, here in Numbers 33, speaking to the people of Israel, he says, if you don't drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, in other words, the surrounding pagan nations that are godless and don't follow the God of Israel, then those of them whom you let remain, they will be as barbs in your eyes, they will be as thorns in your sides. Now, there's a common view that says, Paul's thorn was an issue with his eyes, because he said to the Galatians, if you would have, you could have given me your eyes and gouged them out, referring to some kind of vision infirmity, some kind of issue with his sight or eyes. But I wonder, okay, if Paul's, when he talks about that, if he's actually referring to some possible difficulties he's endured at the hands of persecutors and enemies of God, which in Numbers 33, God does tell the nation of Israel, if you don't drive out the enemies in the land, they're going to be what? Barbs in your eyes. They're going to be thorns in your sides, which is a thorn in the flesh, you might say, right? And you go, that's a stretch. Okay. They shall trouble you in the land where you dwell. And guess what? That happens. Throughout Israel's history as a nation, they don't come and just, bring war and destruction and desolation into the land of Israel, but the surrounding pagan nations end up leading Israel a lot of the times into idolatry and sexual immorality and away from God, and it drives them into destruction. So the nation's trouble, and God tells them, you got to drive them out. Otherwise, they'll trouble you. They'll be a thorn in your side, and I'll do to you as I thought to do to them. And guess what? That ends up happening. This is not the only time where we see this language of a thorn in the side or a thorn in the flesh used regarding enemies of God. Joshua 23:11, it says, be very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. If you turn back and cling to the remnant of these nations remaining among you, which again refer to the pagan nation, enemies of God surrounding Israel, and you make marriages with them so that you associate with them and they with you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. They shall be a snare, and they'll be a trap for you, a whip on your sides, and thorns in your eyes, which is kind of similar to what he said in Numbers 33. But instead of barbs in your eyes or a thorn in the flesh, now it's thorns in your eyes. That's not a good thing. You don't stick thorns in your eyes for fun until you perish from off this good ground the Lord your God has given you. In other words, who here are the thorns in the sides or the eyes or the flesh of Israel as a nation? Well, the surrounding enemy pagan nations that lead them into godlessness and idolatry. Judges chapter 2, similar idea. Judges 2:3 says, so now I say, I will not drive them out from before you, right? Because the people of Israel did not obey the voice of God. So he goes, I'm not going to drive out the nations from before you. They're going to become what? Thorns in your sides. This is a common way of, communicating the surrounding pagan nations that are enemies of God. They're thorns in the sides of God's people, and their gods shall be a snare to you. Okay. The same language is used in Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 6. It says, and you, son of man, God speaking to Ezekiel, don't be afraid of them, nor be afraid of their words, though briars and thorns are with you, and you sit on scorpions. So here, what is Ezekiel surrounded by? Well, he's surrounded by enemies of God, who are actually among the nation of Israel, right? They're called briars. They're called thorns. They're called scorpions. Common ways of communicating enemies of God. Thorns. 2 Samuel 23, and then we'll end here, because I think you know where I'm going with this. It says this, if I can get it. 2 Samuel 23, verse 6. But worthless men are like thorns that are thrown away. They can't be taken with the hand. All throughout Scripture, when it comes to soil that doesn't produce, or hearts that don't produce faith, thorns and thistles represent the wicked nation, the wicked people, the wicked heart. Instead of good fruit, there's thorns and thistles. So I think it is most appropriate to say that when Paul is referring to the thorn in his flesh, right? To keep me from becoming conceited, a thorn was given me in the flesh. It seems most likely the thorn is just constant battle with enemies of God. People who are opposed to God and his Son and his gospel and his kingdom, who are just a plaguing, nagging, painful, difficult thorn in Paul's flesh. They're difficult to deal with. They bring persecutions. Like most of the times, Paul's persecutions and sufferings are the result of enemies of God bringing that on Paul and hating him and persecuting him, just like Jesus. So it makes sense that a messenger of Satan would be someone, right, or at times different people who are sent from Satan, right, to actually bring difficult circumstances and suffering upon Paul for his faithfulness to God. And God allows a lot of this stuff to happen. And God rescues Paul, but he doesn't spare Paul from it. He brings Paul through it, and his grace is sufficient. And there will be things in our lives where they're very similar to what Paul's going through, whether it's emotional, physical, spiritual, whatever it is. These are things that result from our faithfulness to God, that hang around, that he gives us the grace and the power to get through and overcome, but he doesn't take it away. He actually allows us to go through it because his power is made perfect in our weakness. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you haven't already subscribed, go ahead and do that and hit the bell so you can be notified of any future videos that come out. And check out abovereproachministry.com. We have completely free Bible study courses, a 40-day program, a 27-day, and 11-day program, all kinds of free resources. You can get a copy of my book. You can join our online church. You can get some merch. We have a bunch of stuff at abovereproachministry.com. And it's also linked in the description below. Go check that out. And thanks for watching.